The quadratic formula begins with a standard quadratic equation set equal to 0. Ax squared plus bx plus c. We're doing this in a general case. And without knowing the quadratic formula, the only thing we can do is complete the square, which means we're going to not subtract c to both sides, but remember, the first step in completing the square is to divide everything by a. So that's going to be x squared plus b over a times x plus c over a is equal to 0. So if we subtract this constant value, c over a, from both sides, x squared plus b over a times x, and remember, when we complete the square, it's important to leave blank spaces because we're going to need to fill something in here and here. And what we fill in is going to be this term, b over a divided by 2, and then raised to the second power. So b over a divided by 2 is the same as b over a times 1 over 2. This is keep, change, flip when we're dividing fractions. So this becomes b over 2a, which again is raised to the second power. Now when you take a fraction and raise it to the second power, you can apply that exponent, the second power, to both the numerator and the denominator. So we're going to get b squared over 4a squared. And remember, the reason we're doing this is because this is what's going to get added in, b squared over 4a squared on both sides. So now this is factorable, and it might seem confusing to factor this, but remember the one thing we talked about was that a perfect square trinomial, for instance, x squared plus, let's say, 6x plus 9, factors into x plus 6 over 2 to the second power. So that means this quadratic trinomial, which is a perfect square because we completed the square, factors into x plus b over a divided by 2, which we got over here, b over a times 1/2, which is b over 2a. So b over 2a raised to the second power. And this is equal to the sum of that right there. So negative c over a plus b squared over 4a squared is going to have an LCD equal to 4a squared. So that's going to be 4a times this denominator and 4a times that numerator. So 4ac over 4a squared, this is a negative, plus b squared on top, and that's going to be 4a squared on bottom. All right, so if you're familiar with the quadratic formula, and you should be, then you can kind of already see some of the key components forming here. So let's put this into our equation. That's going to be b squared minus 4ac over 4a squared, right? We just rearranged this. So what's up next? The square root property, everyone's favorite square root property. We're going to take the square root of both sides. That becomes x plus b over 2a equals the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 4a squared. If you forgot, and I hope you didn't, remember that's a plus or minus radical b squared minus 4ac over 4a squared. Do not forget this plus or minus. It is very, very important. We've talked about it in class. Now, one thing that we have not talked about regarding radicals, for example, if you are taking the square root of a fraction, that means you can take the square root of the fraction independently. You can apply this radical independently. So something like the square root of 4 over 9 becomes just regular 2 over 3. And that allows us to take the square root of b squared minus 4ac independently from the square root of 4a squared. Now, b squared minus 4ac is not a perfect square, so we're going to leave that alone. But 4a squared is a perfect square. So this becomes x plus b over 2a equals plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over a regular 2a. Now, in order to solve for x, we're going to need to subtract b over 2a from both sides. So I'm going to continue this on the next page, which means we have x equals negative b over 2a plus or minus b squared minus 4ac, which is inside of a square root, over 2a. And since these denominators are the same, we do not need to manipulate anything, and we end up with x equals, on the numerator, negative b plus or minus b squared minus 4ac over 2a. Right, that's how we get this one big fraction line, because we're combining these two fractions. We get this plus minus directly from the square root property. Negative b is from subtracting negative b over 2a from both sides to solve for x. And we got the square root of b squared minus 4ac from taking the square root property. And this is the quadratic formula.